Okay, so I'm recording now.
Right, excellent, got it. Well, thank you very much for coming on this on this interview. And so my name's Gavin, and I've known Nish for 20 years or so. And we're been getting on really well and had a really good interview in the past, and we've been in touch since that. And just before I give Nishad's background, which maybe some of you know, I just say a tiny bit about myself. I'm from Cape Town originally, came to the UK in '71. I've been a student of Adidas for 30 years, and I'm going to be writing my story of before coming across him and afterwards. And so that's been a long time process, and really looking forward to getting that published. And I know in the Unity of Everything, Nishad talked about Adidas, so that's a whole other potential conversation that we could get into. But this one is very much about, it's entitled My Experience with Krishnamurti and David Bowman. And I'd like to give a bit of a bio of Nishad's. You are a writer, an integral thinker who studied under some of the world's finest research mathematicians at University of Warwick. You've got 2 novels, Gifted, the story of a young genius, which reached UK Amazon top 20 in one of the young adult categories. You've also got a book, Dancing with Angels, One Man's Search for the Meaning of Life. And also the one I'm most familiar with is The Unity of Everything, which is a very interesting book, Conversation with David Bowman, which briefly reached #1 in a major UK best-selling chart in the religion and science category. So Nishad is also a public speaker on many spiritual subjects, spoken at the Humanity Rising Global Summit, which reached 20,000 people, the International World Unity Week Conference, and the International Science and Consciousness Conference. You also appeared on the front cover of Integral Leadership Review. So I know this is going to be a very interesting chat, because we're going to cover quite a few aspects of Nish's journey, particularly obviously with relative to Krishnamurti and David Bohm, how he came across them, and finally leading up to his meeting Jiddu Krishnamurti. So I think we can dive in a second. The plan is for any questions at the end of the interview. So if you do have any questions or comments, please save them or write them down for the end, which will be roughly half an hour. And you may all know Nishad's website, integraldream.com, which is a beautiful website with all kinds of resources, interviews, videos, which you may be already familiar with. And in case I forget, we've already planned our next interview for the 10th of April, which is, I think, Nishad's relationship to Adidas. So let's dive straight in. And I think Nishad, I mean, I've recently, to be honest with Krishnamurti, I've been drawn to listening to him more since I've met you, Nishad, and listening to the 1992 talk with David Bowman. I was just drawn into the depth of dialogue, analysis. I mean, it was just fascinating to be drawn into the sense of the real freedom that comes through that dialogue. It's very impressive, the strengths of both participants. So I'd just like to start off with how you came across Krishnamurti and how you met him in the first place, if you'd like to say something about that.
Yeah, thanks, Gavin. So I kind of grew up with Krishnamurti because my dad was quite a serious student of Krishnamurti himself. So I grew up in a house where bookshelves were filled with books by Krishnamurti, about Krishnamurti. I didn't have any interest in it, or maybe even capacity to understand it, until I went to university. And through my teens, I was involved with quite a fundamentalist Christian group. And as I became free of that for various reasons, as I went to university, I still, even though I could no longer believe in these sort of fundamentalist beliefs, there was still a desire for some kind of spiritual practice or spiritual orientation, but one that would not require me to sacrifice my intellect or to sacrifice basic rational thinking. And so I checked out Krishnamurti because it was already there in my house. And I was quite quickly captivated by his teachings, because it seemed to be a very rational way of approaching spiritual matters, rather than this sort of belief-oriented way that I'd been used to. And then I was fortunate enough to hear Krishnamurti the last 3 times that he spoke in the UK, 83, 84, and 85. And I very briefly met him, I think after the 84 talk. It wasn't like a formal meeting. I just went over and said hello for 5 minutes. And I found him to be a very, someone with extraordinary self-possession, just someone who, there was a tremendous presence of being, and somebody who, one of those rare beings who seemed to have really resolved the issues of life, put it that way.
It's wonderful to meet people like that, who have that presence. It's very rare and very wonderful to meet people like that. So yeah, very fortunate to have met him. Yeah. So that's completely wonderful. And so moving on briefly, how would you describe his teachings, or are you able to sort of summarize perhaps what the essence of it is, or how it's impacted you, perhaps?
Yes, I'll try. I mean, his teachings are vast, something like 60 books and 250 videos. But I think the essence of his teaching, I'll give a 1-minute bio of Krishnamurti to put his teachings in context.
Yeah.
At the end of the 19th century, there was a society that was formed by Helena Blavatsky, who was a well-known occultist, called the Theosophical Society. And they believed that there is a basic esoteric essence behind religions, all religions. All religions are saying the same truth, ultimately. That was their belief. And they believed that every 1,000 years, every 2,000 years, there is an incarnation of the divine, or an incarnation of one of the great Buddhas who comes to the earth to guide mankind. So like Krishna, the Buddha, Jesus, and so on. And they believed that another coming of this kind was imminent at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think in the first decade of the 20th century, one of their leaders, called Ledbetter, saw this Indian boy playing on the beach in South India, who was about 14. And Ledbetter said that he had such an incredible aura, and that he recognized him as the potential for this next avatar
amazing.
Who was going to come. And that was, of course, Krishnamurti. And so it was a very strange life. He was adopted, if you like, by the Theosophical Society to be prepared to be this next avatar.
World teacher, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Krishnamurti went along with it. He was brought to the West, lived in great comfort with the very wealthy sponsors of this organization. But when he reached the age of 34, he actually, in a very famous speech, he dissolved the entire organization, because he came to believe that the whole thing was nonsense, that there is no world teacher, he's not an avatar. And that's where his teachings began. And so you can see it in the context of that life. And I think the essence of his teachings could be put into a couple of well-known phrases that he used to commonly use. He would often say, truth is a pathless land. And what he meant by that, my understanding, is that if you want to find the truth, you're not going to find it by following any path, any organization, any tradition, any guru. You have to find out the truth for yourself. And there's no set recipe for doing that, because truth is always changing. So you have to observe that change, and each person's journey might be different. And the second phrase that he used to use a lot is that the observer is the observed. And I think what he meant by that is that if it's possible for you to observe your own mind at work, your own thinking process, to observe your own conditioning as it's at work in life, and through a deep insight into that conditioning, which is not different from who you are your conditioning, it's possible to dissolve that conditioning through some huge insight. And if you're able to do that, then you will have this direct perception of reality without your own conditioned filters getting in the way. And that direct perception of reality will transform you and will free your mind from suffering and conflict and move you into this state of I suppose, what the traditions refer to as awakening or enlightenment.
Sounds very appealing the way you put it. And
Yes.
I can see also why, coming from organized religion and how that can be so stifling. It's very, very different, because there's a freedom of inquiry that you don't find in preordained beliefs and systems. So I can really see why people are drawn to that kind of way of being or exploring consciousness. So yeah, it makes complete sense why you would be drawn to that if you come from a stifling background or conventional religious background.
Yes, and I think the reason I think Krishnamurti was so successful, he was one of the 2 or 3 most successful spiritual teachers from the East in the 20th century. And it is that this kind of teaching seems to have so much legitimacy for a modern and postmodern world. I mean, the modern and postmodern West isn't going to be very inclined to go and sit at the feet of Indian gurus. You know, we're all about independence, and you know, each person is on their own path, and Krishnamurti spoke to that, and I think that said a lot, or contributed a lot to his enormous popularity.
I just have a brief question. I'm thinking of what comes up in the non-dual language, or some of the Indian spiritual traditions, is the witness, and obviously the observer is something that you've mentioned. But did he ever use the term of the witness, or was that more just a traditional term that he wasn't necessarily referring to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question that I've really spent a lot of time trying to, you know, contemplate. My view is that when he was talking about the observer, watching the mind and learning about the thinking processes, he wasn't talking about the same thing that, say, that Hindu traditions talk about when they use the word witness. I think when he was using the word observer, he's still talking about something within the mind.
Sure.
Not something radically beyond the mind, like you'd get in, for example, Vedanta. So I think, rather than, what I found useful when trying to understand Krishnamurti, is that in many ways he's a lot closer to Western psychology than he is to some of these ancient religious traditions. And I think it's about observing the mind, understanding the mind, transforming the mind. But I don't think he's talking about identifying with something transcendent like the witness.
Sure. Oh, that's just very interesting to hear how you put that. Thank you for that. And just moving on briefly, you have described to me briefly in the past about this mystical experience you had, I think, while looking at a lake at one point, and I think your wife was with you at the time, if I'm not mistaken. Could you say something about what that was, and maybe how that's informed your life and approach to spirituality?
I mean, I was studying Krishnamurti night and day, really, from the age of 18 till about 25. And yeah, this interesting experience took place when I was around 22. And I was actually working in quite a demanding job in London at that time, potentially quite a high-paying job as well. And which required studying for exams in the evening as well, intense exams. And one evening I went just for a walk to take a break from it. And the mind just seemed to stop in a way that I'd never experienced prior to that. Thoughts just came to an end. That's how it seemed to me. Thoughts came to an end. The mind just went completely quiet. And I lived in a village, small village in Kent. As I was just walking around this small village in Kent, it's almost as if I noticed nature in a way I'd never really noticed it before. And it was like the natural surroundings that I was looking at almost seemed to shine with this brightness that I'd never, you know, picked up before or noticed before. And it was like that brightness was not separate from me. It was like a part of me. And this experience maybe lasted about half an hour, and it was quite intense. And when I came back home, as a result of that experience, I realized that I couldn't go on with this career that I was following.
Oh, okay.
That there was something else, something deeper, that this experience represented something that was the meaning of life. This is what I wanted to devote my life to. And I walked away from this really high-paying job. And the reason I'm mentioning this to do with Krishnamurti is I think all those years of intensely inquiring in the Krishnamurti way had something to do with this, because the way I experienced it tied in quite nicely with what I was studying from Krishnamurti at the time.
That is very interesting. And I wouldn't be surprised if people on the call have had various degrees of spiritual experience or intuition of that, the true condition. And it's a fascinating subject to consider in general, maybe for another time, in more interactive process about what people go through, how it affects our lives and what we can take from it, or how it transforms our lives. So that's maybe for another time. So
sorry, Gavin,
Nish,
can
yes.
I interrupt you, Gavin? I've got a strange message here from Zoom saying that I need to upgrade now to remove some strange 40-minute time limit.
Oh gosh, it's the 40-minute. Oh gosh, that's how long have we got? We've got 9 minutes then. So well, that's what it says on my oh, that's a real shame, because
I've just prepared. I've pressed upgrade.
Okay, well maybe that'll help.
Maybe that will help. If not, if this meeting, if we are suddenly cut off, unexpectedly, then what, if that's okay with everybody, what I could do is there a way to get back in or create a new one immediately?
Yeah, you just have to get out and get back into the same meeting. I mean, it starts the counter over when you start over.
Oh,
so everybody would have to get out.
Okay, that's
yeah.
So even if it says 40-minute limit, you can still come back again and carry on. Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, it starts the timer over.
Oh, okay. We'll just do that. If that happens,
as long as you clear the meeting completely.
Okay. So if that does happen, unfortunately, we'll just all have to log out and come back in again. Great,
this is a real learning curve for us, and so yeah.
I've done so many Zoom meetings and I've never had this before. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, all right. So
let's carry on, and then
nice.
we'll just log out and come back in again. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So then you were to discover David Bohm with your thesis, or what the theory that you'd had been working on. So would you like to say something about meeting the great man himself, the great physicist, Mr. Bohm?
Yeah, so I came across David Bohm through Krishnamurti, because Krishnamurti had many dialogues with him. And I started to read some of his theories of physics, which I found quite compelling. Because I studied maths at university, I had a basic understanding of fairly basic physics. And he had developed a theory called the implicate order theory, which basically said in 2 sentences that there was this underlying wholeness that underlies the reality that we see is made up of all these apparently separate things and events in space-time. But what Bohm suggested is that there is this underlying wholeness that underlies that reality. And that's what he called the implicate order. And the reality that we perceive, he called the explicate order. And the explicate order arose out of the implicate order and sort of dissolved back into the implicate order in each moment. So the deeper nature of reality, according to Bohm, was wholeness rather than all this multiplicity and fragmentation. So based on that, and also based on my study of the traditions, which I was doing obsessively by this point, I put together this model, which has come to be known as the diamond model, which I've given talks about more recently. And so I wrote a paper and sent this paper on the diamond model to David Bohm, expecting never to hear from him again. and quite astonishingly, he actually phoned me at home, which I really wasn't expecting, and invited me to go and have a chat with him at Birkbeck College in London, where he worked. And that's what I did. And it was definitely one of the highlights of my life. And we recorded the conversation, and that conversation has formed part of one of my books called The Unity of Everything. And he was incredibly generous with his time and his comments.
Thank you, Surya, for your comments. Yeah, it's incredible listening to David Bowman ask the questions of Krishnamurti to bring it to a level that people can understand and use, rather than Krishnamurti's presumption almost that people should have almost like know this. It's almost like a presumption, so he was bringing it to an ordinary level in some sense, I think, in his questions. So it's an incredible dialogue, just, as I was expressing before, really amazing to hear them both bounce off each other in a way that's had real meaning and real depth to it, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversations with David Bohm are some of the best pieces Krishnamurti has done, because David Bohm had this extraordinary intellectual mind.
Yes.
And he forces Krishnamurti to clarify himself in various places, which Krishnamurti might not have been inclined to do by himself.
We have some interesting response from someone or something.
What's up?
I don't know what it was. There was some.
I was laughing.
Good.
Because
Good.
I completely agree.
Yeah. No, it's very, very.
So David Bohm didn't allow Krishnamurti just to remain at the sort of level of mystical, difficult to understand mystical statements. He really forced him to clarify things, I think.
And actually, this one particular interview was it was quite sad at the end, almost, because Krishnamurti was asking, well, who's actually going to use this? Why are we even having this interview? What use is it if people aren't interested and they're not really in touch with the suffering of existence? And so it was left at that point. So I need to watch more interviews, I think, to see if that was expanded on or talked about.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, so you developed your model, and so we could move on to, in your evolution of understanding relative to Krishnamurti, and perhaps the limits you found in him, or any sort of critique you might have of him at this point. That would be very interesting to hear.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we've got like 2 to 3 minutes left.
That's true.
Would this be a good point for everyone to log out and come back in? Does that sound good to everyone?
Yeah, better than to just lose it.
Yeah,
in the middle of
and then we'll start with that next question at the beginning of the.
Okay, wonderful. All right, see everybody soon.
Okay.